They are images dominating U.S. airwaves since the shooting at a Florida high school. Young protesters vowing never again. Most weren't even born when Congress passed its last gun control law. But can they help bring change now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. For Americans, few issues are as divisive as the debate over guns. And it's never more heated than in the direct aftermath of a mass shooting. Time after time, tears turn to anger and demands for tougher laws, which come to nothing. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution allows Americans to bear arms, but it also adds they must be part of a well-regulated militia. The last time Congress passed major firearms control legislation was in 1994. And the most significant part of that measure has since expired. But in the wake of the school shooting spree in Florida earlier this month that killed 17 students and staff, many believe or hope that this time is different. Teenagers, including survivors of the attack, have launched what's become a national movement. They're organizing protests, walking out of classes, and blanketing social media platforms. They vowed to keep the pressure on President Donald Trump and fellow politicians until they do more to control guns.
Teenagers are relentless. They don't give up. And I am interested to see who has the longer stamina between them or the politicians, because I can guarantee you, if the politicians try and stick it out, they're going to retire.
We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett takes us through the latest developments from Washington, D.C.
Arming teachers in the classroom is a controversial idea being promoted by President Donald Trump to prevent school shootings.
If you hardened the sights, you're not going to have this problem, because these guys who lack courage will never go into those schools.
He says he wants to encourage educators to become comfortable with a gun, even offering bonuses for those with firearm skills.
I want my schools protected, just like my banks are protected.
Trump made the comments on Thursday at another White House listening session following the shootings in Parkland, Florida that left 17 people dead, most of them teenagers. Since the school shooting, fellow students have made their voices heard and brought pressure to bear on Trump and other right-of-center politicians to tighten gun restrictions. Arming teachers is not what they have in mind.
That's their plan anyway.
Mark Barden lost his son in 2012 in the Sandy Hook school shooting.
School teachers have more than enough responsibilities right now than to have the awesome responsibility of lethal force to take a life.
On Twitter, Trump attempted to clarify his position and floated other proposals, such as background checks for those buying a gun, raising the legal purchasing age to 21, and again suggesting the end of the sale of so-called bump stocks that increase a weapon's firepower. Not all, but some of those ideas are at odds with the biggest gun rights group in the United States, the National Rifle Association, or NRA, pushing back against any effort to limit gun ownership.
The elites don't care not one whit about America's school system. For them, it's not a safety issue, it's a political issue. They care more about control and more of it.
Gun owners agree.
We have a right to protect ourselves, protect our children. So if they're properly trained, why not be able to use that?
I think that it would send a message across the nation that we are taking this into our own hands, we're fighting back, and we will be the first line of defense.
And while there is support for at least some of Donald Trump's proposals, even the most basic limits on gun ownership will require congressional approval, an accomplishment that in the past has proved difficult. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In New York, Paul Barrett, adjunct professor of law at New York University and author of the book Glock, The Rise of America's Gun. From Rindge in the U.S. state of New Hampshire, Richard Feldman, a former regional political director at the National Rifle Association. He joins us on Skype. And in Birmingham, in the UK, Scott Lucas, professor of American politics at the University of Birmingham. Thank you all for joining us. Now, Scott, I want to start with you. The reactions to other mass shootings in the past seem to follow almost a script. You would have the shock and horror and grief. You would then have politicians offering thoughts and prayers to the families of the victims and the wounded. You would have demands for action, but then ultimately no action. Looking at this from the outside, things seem different this time. Is that the case?
Certainly is from my perspective. I mean, if you had asked me a week ago, just after the shootings in Parkland, Florida, at this high school, I would have said it's going to be Groundhog's Day, that we'll go through grief, we'll go through regret, we'll go through statements that something must be done, and then a month, maybe even 2 weeks from now, there'll be a mass shooting, and it starts all over. But for me, it's been different this time, and I think it's the conjunction of two things. I think the first is social media and what it can do in terms of a message spreading very quickly. And then secondly, and more importantly, this group of survivors from Douglas High School, these students who chose not to remain silent, but amidst their tragedy and trauma, to speak out and say something must be done. Something must be done by politicians, and that it's incumbent upon all Americans to call for action. And the spread of that message, coupled with the silence for the White House for several days about gun control, it meant that all of a sudden we had this groundswell, which is not just rhetoric, but I think a demand. And culminating on Wednesday night in the town hall in Florida, an event which I think has overshadowed Donald Trump's statements. At that town hall, where students, teachers, and law enforcement officers really challenged both politicians and the NRA, I think this is the most pressure that those politicians and the NRA have faced probably since the 1990s. Look, something must be done, not just about the shooters, but about the supply of guns as well, beginning with semi-automatic weapons.
Richard, what's your reaction to what Scott just said? Do you believe that these demonstrations, that these protests, that these impassioned pleas could actually lead to legislation on gun control this time?
Well, we've certainly been here many times before. I hope that it does lead to action that's focused directly on the problem, not just action that talks about the issues surrounding the problem. I am somewhat hopeful this time that we actually are discussing gun violence restraining orders, which in this case and several others might well have prevented the incident. If we talk about solutions that are actual, doable, and related to the problem, we may actually get somewhere. That would be a good thing.
Paul, I want to ask you specifically about the Second Amendment. In your view, does the Second Amendment protect assault weapons? Different courts in the U.S. have ruled differently on this issue. What do you say?
Well, I mean, I think what's important is what the United States Supreme Court says, and in the relevant 2008 decision, then Justice Scalia wrote for the majority that a ruling that upheld the right to keep a firearm at home did not necessarily preclude other forms of gun control. I think that law remains the case today. And I think that it would be a very close case before the Supreme Court as to whether a restriction on semi-automatic military-style weapons would be upheld. But I don't think we're going to get that far because I don't think there's going to be a federal law passed restricting so-called assault weapons.
Scott, a moment ago you spoke about just how brave these traumatized students have been in their actions, in raising their voices, in confronting politicians from House members to senators to even the president. Something quite disturbing has happened in the wake of the shooting. You've had far right-wing media outlets, you've had people on social media attacking some of these students, calling them crisis actors, really trading in these conspiracy theories about them. Do you believe that that is because these students are such a force, that there is a fear that they will be able to accomplish what so many generations before them were not able to do and start a mass movement?
Yeah, absolutely. Social media cuts both ways. It gave a platform for these students, teachers to have a voice, which was then picked up by the mainstream. But social media, of course, is a platform for other groups, alt-right groups, some hard-line gun owners, and even some members of the NRA to try to whip up these conspiracy theories because they need to delegitimize these voices, these legitimate voices. They need to say that somehow they're manipulative or dangerous. And so we get this type of tactic which tries to push them to the side. Now, the NRA, Dana Loesch, on the one hand, the other night on Wednesday night said, oh, of course, we recognize your voices are legitimate. We recognize, we don't associate ourselves with these attacks. Yet the very next day, Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, and Dana Loesch go in and they attack the media and they try to portray the fact that this is all a fabrication, that the media are taking advantage not only of these students, but of crying white moms, in Dana Loesch's words. And I think what it shows is that the NRA is rattled, the Trump administration is rattled, but at the same time, they will fight. They will fight hard against even limited measures, let alone the ban on semi-automatic weapons. So if, as I think, this case continues, unlike others, all the way up until the elections in November, it is going to be a very divisive fight, or at least the NRA and its supporters will try to make it a very divisive fight.
Okay, Richard, building on what Scott just said, because he mentioned Dana Loesch's remarks. Now, I want to pause for a moment. I want to play a portion of NRA spokesperson Dana Loesch's speech at the Conservative Political Action Conference on Thursday.
Now, I'm going to say something that some people are going to say is controversial. So I'll say it really slowly so all the people on the platform in the back can hear me loud and clear. Many in legacy media love mass shootings. You guys love it. Now, I'm not saying that you love the tragedy, but I am saying that you love the ratings. Crying white mothers are ratings gold to you and many in the legacy media in the back.
Richard, what do you think of that rhetoric? And also, after hearing that, do you think that the NRA at this point would be willing to make any concessions based on what some members of the Republican Party are suggesting?
Well, everyone almost makes a mistake when they talk about the NRA as though that's some monolithic organization. Politicians would be very wise to limit when they accuse or speak of the NRA. Are they talking about the NRA senior leadership? Are they talking about the vast membership? I'm an NRA member. I don't see them talking about me, but yet when they say the NRA, they are talking about me. This plays right into NRA leadership's hands. The more the NRA is accused of being a bad actor, the more they are the boogeyman in this thing, the better off it is for NRA's recruitment and mobilization in this year's election. Frankly, up until this incident, the gun issue was so quiescent that it wouldn't have played any role. For politicians to think, having gone through the last 35 years or so on this issue, that 7-8 months out from the election, the energy that's being generated now is the wind at their back on the gun control side, is to completely misread history. If anything, it's just the opposite. It will energize the pro-gun forces, while the gun control forces 8 months from now will still give lip service, but they will not vote for or against candidates on the basis of this issue. 120 million gun owners, or some percentage of them, certainly will.
Paul, what do you think? Do you believe that these remarks that we're hearing from the leadership of the NRA in the wake of the Parkland shooting will ultimately, hurt or help the NRA?
Well, first of all, I'll say that in terms of my opinion, I thought those remarks were despicable. So I'll say that flatly. Second, I think Richard points to an important truth, which is that the structure of the gun debate in the United States is uneven. It's not straight across in terms of the degree of passion, energy, and organizational will that each side has. The pro-gun side, the libertarian side, anti-regulation, for them, for many of them, this is their premier issue. It's very rare on the pro-regulation side for guns to be actually people's top issue. And after some time passes, I think my prediction would be that this keeps the NRA activated, keeps its followers activated, and more politically liberal, pro-regulation people will tend to get distracted by other issues come election time.
Scott, in the last few days, we've heard President Trump indicate that he's actively searching for some type of middle ground that would satisfy his base, but also those demanding change and some form of gun control. Now, he said that he favors raising the age at which someone can buy semi-automatic rifles from 18 to 21, that he potentially wants to expand background checks, that he's ready to prohibit bump fire stocks, which can effectively make semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons. Do you believe this can actually be done in such a polarized landscape?
Well, let me say, first of all, that this isn't a search for a central ground. The White House's belated reaction through Donald Trump is trying to divert to a completely different place. Rather than taking on central issues, you talk, for example, about dealing with bump stocks, which, while they were responsible for the Las Vegas shooting, have not been responsible for most mass shootings, let alone the tens of thousands of deaths across the U.S. You talk about expanding background checks, when in fact the Trump administration has actually rolled back checks, for example, on those who might have mental conditions. So no, this is a diversion. Now, in terms of what happens next, let me just take up the points that Paul and Richard make, and I think they're quite interesting. And I want to make two sort of remarks to them. The first is, absolutely, when we talk about the NRA and talk about the politics here, we're talking about the NRA leadership. But I think there's a challenge out there to the many, many members of the NRA, which is whether they just simply accept this now or whether they make their own response and say, our leaders don't necessarily speak for all of us. We too are searching for a way forward. And then the second thing I want to talk about is we may be in a different place now. I'm not sure we are, but we may be. And that is, you know, you got three older guys talking about this issue here. What you're seeing in this past week is a younger generation embodied in those Parkland students. And they may not play politics by the rules that we've grown accustomed to. They may keep this up. They may march. They may rally. And if those younger folks, many of whom will be of voting age for the first time in November, keep themselves mobilized and keep challenging the politicians, we may have to accept that the way things have happened in the past 35 years may not be the way that they shake out in the next year, 2 years, 5 years.
Richard, so many members of the international community simply cannot understand why guns are so important to Americans, why there are so many Americans that say that guns are essential to protecting their liberties. Why is it? Is it simply the Second Amendment, or is it much more than that?
Well, it's actually much deeper than that. Guns are a potent symbolic issue, and people who identify on the pro-gun side really see their relationship with this government of ours as a matter of trust. If the government trusts me with the guns I've owned for 30, 40, 50 years and never misused, on some level, they're worthy of my trust in them. But if all of a sudden that same government says, well, somebody misused a gun, therefore you're no longer eligible or worthy to own them, the government is saying they don't trust us. When the government doesn't trust the people feel the government is no longer worthy of their trust. And in that sense, one can begin to understand the incredible potency that the gun rights debate has in American politics. It's far more than about guns per se, although clearly it is about guns as well.
Paul, there are now renewed calls for instituting red flag laws. Could you explain to our viewers what exactly those laws are and what they would prohibit when it comes to gun control?
Sure. Yeah, Richard referred to these laws earlier by a different label, but basically red flag laws allow a person's family or law enforcement to go to a state court and petition the court to issue an order that a person who is disturbed, and there has to be evidence of that, should, for some limited period of time at least, sacrifice their ability to possess firearms, so that if the court finds in favor of the petitioners, law enforcement would go to the person's home and literally take away their guns for some period of time until the person was deemed mentally fit. This is not a brand new idea, but it is sort of emerging on many fronts. You've seen laws like this passed in Washington State, in Oregon, and it's being examined in a large number of other states, and that was actually even before the Parkland shootings. And I think this is one example of a gun control approach accomplished at the state level that may well catch on and gain additional momentum as a result of the Florida shootings.
Richard, you've argued in the past that there needs to be a lot more included in discussions on gun control and gun laws in the U.S. What do you think needs to be included in the debate and the discussion?
Well, I think in some ways we're headed there. This is an example where a change in the law allowing these gun violence restraining orders would have stopped several of the last shooters from obtaining the guns that they actually used. Now, what we never can say is, might they have gotten a gun from some other source, an illegal source? But we can only focus on one issue at a time and do the best we can. Heretofore, we've had this circus-like approach that whenever an instance like this happens, everything's on the table. And we start getting, talking about assault weapons, magazine capacity, eliminating the Second Amendment. Once that debate starts and we lose any focus, nothing's going to happen. So far, this debate has kept some focus. I think this is a partial answer, the gun violence restraining orders, and I endorse them.
Scott, I'm going to give you the last word here very quickly. Does the fact that these kinds of shootings continue to happen in the U.S. affect the credibility of the United States in the eyes of the rest of the world? And if so, how?
I think it does for many people. You know, you have a country which proclaims the rights of the individual that we've heard about there, which proclaims, you know, the achievements of the U.S. But when you get the rights of the individual, almost trying to wish away the fact that you have not just these mass killings, but the tens of thousands of killings that occur and don't make headlines. When you have politicians that will use diversions to avoid talking about this, when you have discussions that only talk about, and they should talk about, for example, restraining orders, but don't talk about the fundamental, which is the ability to have a weapon of war, the ability to have an assault rifle, something which there is no justification for in the hands of the individual citizen, then I think people put their hands up and say, look, America, it is time to put some type of meaning to where your mouth is. It is time to listen to the cries that you've had in the past week from those who have suffered from violence, because it cannot go on. It is damaging American society, and it is damaging the example that American society has tried to offer the world in recent decades.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks to all our guests, Paul Barrett, Richard Feldman, and Scott Lucas. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.